Honorable Minister, Mr. Scindia, Mr. TV Narendran, President AIMA, Mr. Ranganathan, Nikhil, Sawhney, Vice President, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this special session being held on a very pertinent theme with one of India's most charismatic ministers, Mr. Jyotiraditya Scindia. Honorable Minister, it is a privilege to have you and many thanks for joining us at the 49th National Management Convention. You are a prolific leader of the government and a 5-time member of Parliament. You have led key ministries in different governments over the past decade and a half, including communications and IT, commerce and industry and power, and now the civil aviation and steel ministries. You have always been and remain a transformational leader. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Honorable Minister with a huge round of applause. Mr. Narendran, it's always a pleasure to have you with us. You are the global CEO of one of India's iconic industrial giants, Tata Steel, and you are an ambassador of Indian industry around the world. We look forward to an exciting conversation between you and the Honorable Minister. Ladies and gentlemen, the theme of the NMC addresses the ongoing changes in the world and India's potential to achieve a position of advantage in the next global order. It is a very complex situation as multiple shifts are occurring at the same time. There is a tilt of the global economic growth towards the East, and the West struggle to maintain its primacy in finance and technology. There is also the geopolitical struggle between resurgent countries over territory and trade routes. The supply chain are shifting following the COVID shock, and the weaponization of energy is fueling inflation and slowing the global economy. The rules and institutions of global governance are facing demands of reform by the emerging powers. Overall, it's quite a minefield to cross for management leaders. However, the restructuring of the world order is an opportunity for India to stake its claim for global leadership. With these words of introduction, I welcome you all once again for this intriguing session and wish everyone a great conference ahead. And may I now invite the President of AIMA, Mr. C.K. Ranganathan, to say his welcome words.
Honorable Minister, Mr. TV Narendran, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to the theme session of the National Management Convention. Honorable Minister, it's a pleasure to have you and many thanks for joining us in this convention. Mr. Narendran, great to have you moderating the fireside chat. Ladies and gentlemen, the world is not what it used to be even a couple of years ago. The COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine have sharply accentuated the changes that have been developing since the financial crisis of the late 2000s. The post-Soviet unipolarity of the world is being challenged by new contenders, and Asia is becoming the theater of global power struggle. The emerging economies are seeking a greater role in global governance, and some of them are flexing their newfound economic and military muscle. There is a real possibilities of rewarding of national boundaries in some parts of the world and the reconfiguration of economic and security alliances. Finance, commerce, and technology are the new frontiers for nations, and the breakdown of consensus and trust is taking its toll on the global governance and economy. The world is churning and everything is up in the air. Unsettling as the situation is for India, it is also a big opportunity for the country to reinvent itself as a major manufacturing and technology center of the world. It is also an opportunity for India to position itself as the swing country in the global balance of power. India needs to leverage its size, strength, and sophistication to claim regional and global leadership. To achieve that objective, India must try to ensure a long period of calm and stability both inside and outside. It's an opportunity India cannot afford to miss. We look forward to a great discussion on India's current advantage and its strategy to thrive in the new world order between the Honorable Minister and Mr. Narendran. It's now my pleasure to invite Mr. Narendran to conduct this session.
Thank you. Thank you, CK. Thank you, Rekha, thank you, Mr. Minister. Thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure to talk to you and looking forward to hearing your views. The context is, of course, as described by CKR and Rekha, is about a world which is rapidly changing. There's a recalibration from an economic point of view. There's a recalibration from a geopolitical point of view. There's disruption because of technology. There's potential disruption because of climate change. And on top of that, we've had COVID and the situation in Europe. So a lot has been happening, but a lot of the governance structures in the world are still a bit of a legacy structure which was set up post-World War II. So there's a lot changing, and India is obviously one of the most exciting economies and countries. So in this emerging world, which is recalibrating itself in many different ways, and in a context where India is growing, how do you see the situation globally, and how do you see India's role, both as someone impacted by what's happening and with the potential to play a leadership role?
So first of all, thank you very much for having me this morning at AIMA's annual conference. It's always a pleasure to be here, to be able to an opportunity to interact with all of you. I think the question that has been put by Narendran ji is not only topical but also extremely apt. And I fear that the half an hour, 40 minutes we have is probably not even enough to address this question, because as Ranganathan ji in his address primed this discussion, and as Narendran ji has taken off where Ranganathan ji left, we're really talking about the global world order. We're talking about the world stage. And for a change, we are talking about what confronts humanity as challenges. So there are verticals within which countries exist, but beyond the verticals within which countries exist, there are also horizontals that affect the world globally. And when these eras come about, if you will, it brings about with it a global churn. Our Prime Minister has always said that कुछ लोगों को चुनौती में चुनौती ही दिखती है, चुनौतियों में दुर्लभता दिखती है, चुनौतियों में कठिनाइयां दिखती हैं, पर भारत को सदैव इतिहास गवाह है कि चुनौतियों में भारत को सदैव अवसर दिखता है. And that is the new India. The new India that is unfazed in the face of global challenges, not only local challenges, but global challenges. The India that through this period that Narendran ji is talking about, the last 3 to 4 years, has really emerged on the global stage. And under the leadership of our Prime Minister. Our situation 8 years ago vis-a-vis our situation today. Today, when there are domestic challenges, we look to the Prime Minister for his leadership. But it doesn't stop there. When there are global challenges, global leadership looks to our Prime Minister for leadership to be able to steer the path through. And let me give you 2 examples of that. The first is COVID, a situation that probably the world had not seen in the last century. And it is India, through this challenge of COVID, that has really emerged on the global stage in terms of leadership. A country that used to import vaccines, the shots that Narendran ji and I and all of you have had, whether it's BCG or others, all imported. And imported 10, 15 years after their invention. Today, India has invented 2 vaccines and exported it to 100 countries in the world. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the new India. So, moving from avishkar, invention, to even fiscal management. You had countries across the world that looked at a rapid, escalated, uncontrolled, unchecked increase in M3 supply, money supply. And the need of the hour for those countries was to make sure that everyone has got money in their personal bank accounts. But they could not foresee the detrimental effects of that policy, which would result in uncontrolled, spiraled inflation. Today, the fact that the United States of America is experiencing 8 to 9% inflation, the UK 10 to 12% inflation, negative growth rates, possibly stagflation environments, and within India, because of a controlled situation, making sure that we have the safety net in place for our vulnerable population, and concentrating on capex that would really unleash the next round of growth over the next 3 to 4 years. Today, India is emerged on the world stage as the highest GDP growth nation across the comity of nations in the world. So that is the change that you're seeing. And even on foreign affairs, on security issues, today we are moving from strategic conservatism to strategic autonomy. Voicing India's voice on the world stage in terms of what we believe in. And that voice is not only getting heard, that voice is looked up to. So across various parameters today, India has emerged. And we have used this opportunity of a challenge to actually emerge onto the world stage. So I believe the future of our country is unparalleledly bright. We are today the 5th largest economy in the world in terms of economic parameters. If you look at purchasing parity, the 3rd largest economy. And the day is not far. By the end of the century, we will move from being the 5th largest economy to becoming the 3rd largest economy in the world, ladies and gentlemen. And that is our potential, that is our future. Greater per capita income growth, greater spend on infrastructure, 35% increase year on year in government capex. What we expect from the likes of Narendran ji and his biradari, the private sector is multiples of that, which I'm sure they will come forward and put in place. But a 10.5 lakh crore capex program in a year. Today, we as ministers are monitoring on a fortnightly basis. Are our CPSCs sticking to the capex targets that they have talked about, whether it's front-ended, back-ended, whichever way? Monitoring the capex of institutions such as Narendran ji's. That are they spending, are they putting in capacities? Because we see that growth potential coming. The difference between India and our Southeast Asian neighbors is that we ourselves are a huge demand-led economy. So we produce not only for export, but we produce internally for consumption ourselves as well. And therefore, across commodities, including his commodity, we have moved in the last 8 years from being net importers to becoming net exporters. And that's the change that you're seeing in India.
Thank you. No, that's wonderful. And I think this is a story that we are really proud of in terms of how India has really risen up to the challenges. But you've led a sector which was really, in some sense, traumatized by COVID, which is the aviation sector, during a very difficult time. So can you talk us through, how you led that sector? Because I know this sector struggled a lot, but has come through and India is the 3rd largest aviation market in the world. So how do you see the sector and the future of the sector?
Well, I think that as far as civil aviation is concerned, the whole paradigm has changed. Earlier, the notion was that you've got to have some base and some capacity to be able to venture out and ask for an airport to be located in your city. Because the economic growth that powers that city and its environs, that becomes the basis for the location of an airport. Today, that whole paradigm has turned on its head. i.e., where you have airports, you will have economic growth. And therefore, the demand situation has completely changed. And one of the reasons why that has happened is that we as human beings have changed in the last 2 to 3 decades. The one thing that is scarce for every human being is time. No longer do we have the luxury of traveling for 9-10 hours, getting to a location, spending 2 days and traveling 9-10 hours back. झट करके जाना है, फट करके वापस आना है. और अगर झट करके जाना है और फट करके वापस आना है, आपके पास और कोई चारा नहीं है, नागर विमानन क्षेत्र से ही आपको गुजरना होगा और सफर करना होगा. And therefore the demand for civil aviation as a sector has grown. Let me just give you some numbers. In 2013-14, total number of travelers in India were close to 73 million. We are today at 144 million, which means that in 7-8 years, we have doubled the number of travelers. International, 13-14, we were at 37 million. We are today at 60 million. So if you total both the numbers, domestic and international, roughly 200 million, 20 crore, I look at a conservative figure, in 5 to 7 years, that number of 200 million will double to 400 million. So what does that mean? That means that the infrastructure on the ground, that has to increase at the same pace. We had 74 airports in India in the last 70 years. In the last 8 years, we have gone from 74 airports and added an additional 67 airports and gone to 141 airports in a period of 8 years. And I see that number of 141 between airports, heliports and waterdromes going from 141 currently to 220 in the next 5 to 6 years. That's the kind of increase in capacity we're looking at. Our fleet, we had 400 aircraft in 2013-14. Today we have close to 700. And I'm looking at a fleet addition of close to 15 to 17% on an annual basis going forward. Having said that, what was most important during COVID period was to make sure that you calibrate the return of the sector. Which is why we had first capacity caps in place to take care of COVID, and I got rid of capacity caps almost about a year ago. And so today we are working at 100% capacity or beyond. We also had fare bands in place, because my concern was that we must make sure that our customer is not exorbitantly charged for civil aviation fares when there are only a few flights operating. Parallelly, we must ensure that the customer has choice. And therefore, the innate capability of firms to cut prices and make sure you drive your competitors out of the market and go beyond the floor so as to gain market share and squeeze other companies out, that must also be prevented. And therefore, I had a price band in place. A lower price band, below which you could not go, and an upper price band, above which you could not go. Protect the interests of the customer and protect the interests of the sector. When stabilization has happened, and we had peak traffic of roughly about 4 lakhs pre-COVID, we surpassed that in April, May at roughly about 4.07 lakhs on a couple of days. So when stabilization has happened, we've removed the price bands as well. I believe in a free market. This is a sector that's deregulated. And I think we must allow the private sector to play its part. And I see growth in civil aviation. We've had a new entrant enter the market, Akasa Air, after almost 2 decades. where we used to hear stories of people being weeded out. We are also seeing a new entrant in the cargo sector through Pradhan Air. So I am looking at tremendous capacity building, but the important point that needs to be made here is that it's about time in civil aviation that we set up the ecosystem. Very much like the auto sector, where you have an OEM and then you have a bunch of ancillaries. Similarly, in civil aviation, it's not only about airlines and airports, but it's about flying training organizations. It's about cargo. It's about ground handling. It's about drones. It's about all the steps that we need to put in place to put the ecosystem in place. And those steps are being very firmly supplanted as we speak.
Great. There's a subject which I know is close to your heart, and that's climate change, and you've talked about that. The two sectors that you're leading, aviation and steel, are hard-to-abate sectors, contribute in a big way to the CO2 emissions. How do you see the future of these sectors in the context of climate change?
Well, first of all, let me take civil aviation. First, I think it's important to be able to dispel the notion. The civil aviation sector is a very highly visible sector. It's a very high-profile sector, attracts a lot of attention. But actually, if you look at the contribution of GHG, greenhouse gases and carbon emissions, it's a very small percentage. It's only roughly about 2% of carbon emissions in the world. But having said that, I think it's important that we shoulder our responsibility. So one of the first steps that I took when I took over as minister is to put in place a carbon mapping profile for all our airports. And today, let me tell you, we've got 2 or 3 private sector airports that have done a tremendous job with regard to being carbon neutral. Kochi for one, Delhi Airport the second. And as far as the Airports Authority of India is concerned, we will have close to about 92 to 93 airports that will become carbon neutral by the end of 2024. So that's a plan that we put in place as far as the infrastructure is concerned. As far as planes and flights are concerned, one of the most obvious, there are a number of technologies that are evolving, hydrogen being one of them. But I believe that is certainly in the far distance as far as civil aviation is concerned, for obvious reasons with regard to safety and all of those things. But one of the low-hanging fruit is SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuel, made of carbon-friendly products. And I think SAF is a technology that has been proven as far as our sector is concerned, because it's only a drop-in into the fuel tanks. Already planes across the world and even in India have flown at 50% of one engine on sustainable aviation fuel. But the issue with SAF is not necessarily the applicability or the usability on aircraft, but it really is the production of enough quantity of SAF as well as the logistics of providing it to the airport as a drop-in fuel into the aircraft. That is the key issue. So we need to deal with the hurdles on a global scale, not an Indian scale alone, but on the global scale with regard to the production of enough of SAF as well as the logistics of bringing it to the airport to be used in civil aviation carriers. And there are a lot of companies that are working on that technology. As far as steel is concerned, Narendran ji, this is a very important point on my agenda with you. All the integrated steel plants as well as the secondary steel industry. I have set up 2 separate advisory groups and I'm engaging with both on a number of issues, but green steel is one of them. And I think we need to move quickly along that path as well in terms of using new technologies, whether it's through carbon limiting raw material, whether it's the technology of the blast furnaces that need to be evolved within our steel plants, or whether it's across the value chain in both industries. And both of those issues are things that are very, very high on the anvil for me going forward.
Thank you. I've been working very closely with the minister, particularly over the last 2 months on steel. And, we've probably had 4 or 5 meetings every 2 weeks. He has a meeting. Good thing is he wants the minutes of the meeting out within hours of the meeting. and normally he's chasing the private sector to close the ATR, so it's a very refreshing change in some sense. But what are your perceptions of the industry and of the steel industry? It's again a core industry, always in the headlines for good reasons and bad reasons. So what are your initial perceptions on the industry, and any advice to the industry in steel?
Well, I think steel is one of the primary movers of any economy. And the fact today that we are the second largest steel producers in the world. We today have a capacity of close to 155 MTPA, and we produce close to about 120 million tons per annum. We're way behind the largest steel producer in the world. But the fact that India today has emerged as the second largest steel producer in the world, we also have a tremendous plan in place in terms of our Vision 2030, where we want to go from our current capacity, production capacity of 155 million tons to 300 million tons per annum. And that's going to be pushed forward both by the integrated steel producers, such as SAIL and Tata Steel and others, as well as the secondary steel sector. I do believe that India's consumption demand for steel is increasing extremely rapidly. The very fact that we have a 10.7 lakh crore plan, capex plan in place from the government side will increase the demand of steel multifold. We've seen an increase in demand of close to about 10.6% in the last fiscal, and I'm very confident that will only continue to grow. But I do believe that within steel production as well, A, increase capacity, B, keep in mind safety measures, C, move to green steel, and D, most importantly, what's very close to my heart and the Prime Minister's heart, is produce a made in India brand for steel. And I think that's something that we've been talking about within our advisory committee, both at your level as well as the secondary steel industry. We need to produce a made in India brand. That's not only the story of Atmanirbhar Bharat, but that's the story of Bharat appearing on the world stage as a world-class producer of steel. And we need to be able to put the parameters in place so that it can get that made in India brand, irrespective of the producer who produces that steel, ensuring that there is no dilution of the quality of steel that goes out of our country. So that's something that we are working on as well. But I believe that the possibilities are tremendous in the steel industry, and it forms the foundation and the fulcrum upon which any emerged or developed or world order economy certainly transponds itself on the world stage.
Thank you. You know, the Prime Minister and you yourself, as part of this conversation, talked about the role of private sector. And, oftentimes the private sector has a long list of asks on the government. What would your ask be of the private sector? You have a lot of private sector represented here.
Well, just to finish on one comment on steel, we've, as you've probably known, that we've put in place a very important production-linked incentive scheme for steel, for specialty steel, close to about 6,220 crores. And I'm glad to report to all of you today that we closed all the applications a day or two ago, and we've received close to 79 applications from 35 companies, looking at putting in place a capacity of close to 28 million tons per annum of new specialty steel, which will result in close to the creation of 70,000 jobs. So those are the kind of levers that Government of India, along with the private sector and the CPSCs, are putting in place going ahead. And I really believe that, and this is something that I have practiced in the years that I've been in government, that it's not an us versus you game. It is not a government versus private sector game. I really believe that in your success does not only lie the government's success, but lies India's success. And therefore, government's role has to move from being a regulator to being a facilitator. What is it that I can do to help you succeed? Because in your success lies our success, lies India's success. And that's the way we need to function. And therefore, in the advisory committees that we set up, whether within steel or within civil aviation, I firmly believe that it's not a ministry versus our CPSEs or a ministry versus the private sector. I and my ministry have to be as accountable to the private sector and the CPSEs as we expect the CPSEs and the private sector to be accountable to us. And therefore, at the end of every advisory committee, as Narendran ji said, a minutes is issued within 4 to 5 hours of that advisory committee meeting concluding. And in the next advisory committee, prior to the meeting starting, I as minister have to present an action taken report to all the members of the committee. कि इन मुद्दों पर हमारी चर्चा हुई, and on based on that, this is the action that I have taken, this is where we have completed what you had asked for, and this is where what you had asked for cannot be done because of the following reasons. So that accountability has to be there from us in government as well to you, because it's only when that feeling is engendered that we will succeed as a collective and not as an individual.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. You know, the other subject which you talked to us about is technology. And again, technology is certainly going to disrupt the two sectors that you're leading. But in general, any thoughts on technology, and you see that as a risk, an opportunity, a challenge, or how do you see it?
I see that as probably the largest opportunity that India has. Because as far as technology is concerned, we are at the cusp of the curve. It is the world that will either follow us, or it is us that will adopt the world's technology and ensure that it is used at a massive scale. Case in point for you is telecom. I remember as a relative youngster, when I came back from university from abroad at the age of 22, 23, we didn't have any of these boxes that we carry around, and they've become more than appendage. They've become a part of our lives. We almost don't feel complete without them, unfortunately, let me add. But we didn't have a single one of them around. And each one of them costed, when they came in 1993, end of 93, they costed about a lakh of rupees and used to pay $16 a minute to talk on one of these. Today, they're ubiquitous. You get them at 3,500, 4,000 rupees a piece, and voice is completely free. So the ability of India through the volume game to change a low volume, high margin business into a high volume, low margin business. Another example for you is civil aviation. 20, 25 years ago, it would cost you the earth to fly from Delhi to Bombay. Today you can fly between Delhi and Bombay at probably 10% of that cost. That capability, and therefore the leveraging of technology. Please remember that technology is only an enabler. And it is the application of that technology in your process that will yield you superior results. And therefore the steel industry, the way you all are using, I'm learning from you all, the way you're using artificial intelligence, the way you're using Internet of Things in your production processes to be able to identify where defects are taking place within your production chain and to be able to correct that, to ensure Six Sigma products. That capability, I believe, India is way ahead of the curve. And technology, yes, is a disruptor, but it is a welcome disruptor as far as India is concerned, to be able to produce amazing results across the manufacturing sector for the world in the days to come.
Thank you, Mr. Scindia and Mr. Narendran, for such a wonderful and interesting session. May I now invite Vice President AIMA, Mr. Nikhil Sawhney, on the stage to deliver the concluding remarks, please.
Honorable Minister Jyotiraditya M Scindia, Mr TV Narendran, ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to conclude this very exciting session Honorable Minister, it's been an absolute pleasure listening to you and getting to know your perspective on India's place and role in the emerging world order. You have a top view of government and geopolitics, and you have helped us appreciate the opportunities and challenges that are in front of India. In your own ministries, you are creating examples of transformational change in approach and strategy, and the results are there for everyone to see. As I was discussing with Rekha right now, you epitomize a model where you've already been in business school at one of the most laudable institutions. But if it's possible for AIMA to do a case study on how you operate your ministries, it would be incredibly enlightening for all of us. And it may be possible, if it is possible, we would very much like to see if you may find that acceptable. But many, many thanks for joining us at this National Management Convention and talking to us about your assessment of India's strength and opportunities. It is always a pleasure to have you. Mr. Narendran, it was a great session, and thank you for holding an important conversation with the Honorable Minister. You stirred the discussion very ably, and you raised many urgent and pertinent issues that keep Indian CEOs awake at night. It is a pleasure having you, and many thanks for moderating the session. Ladies and gentlemen, the world is undergoing a dramatic change as the tectonic plates of geopolitics, trade, and technology are shifting. The COVID shocks that accentuated the already existing national ambitions and anxieties. Since COVID's breakout, there have been a significant loss in mutual trust between nations and a substantial increase in foreign and trade policies differences. While India is not in a position to impose an order on a disorderly world, India is in a perfect position to influence the new shape of the world. India is being wooed by every side because of its ability to tilt the balance of the global economy and power. And India should not bargain for a fair deal from global powers and push for a reform of the global geopolitical, financial, and security institutions. May I request AIMA President to present a green memento to the Honorable Minister as well as to Mr. Narendran.